Hello, I'm Gonçalo Marcelo, and I would like to welcome you all to this session, which is the sixth session of the conference cycle, New Directions in Social Hermeneutics. Now, for this session, we're going to discuss a hot topic of these last few years, more than 15 years even, which is hermeneutical injustice. Now, as I was saying off the record shortly before this session, we have a slight change in the program because we were supposed to have two talks today by Ilke Henno from Potsdam University with a talk titled Silence as Epistemic Resistance, and then Matthew Congdon from Vanderbilt University with a talk titled Hermeneutical Injustice and Moral Articulation. Now, unfortunately, Hilke ultimately will not be able to join us today, so her talk has been postponed and will be re-announced soon as part of one of the other sessions of this conference cycle. And so for today, we are having Matthew's talk. Let me just do a short introduction to the topic and to Matthew, just very briefly. Well, this cycle gathers a lot of people interested in hermeneutics, in critical theory, and other closely related areas, such as, well, in this case, epistemic injustice, but also social ontology, etc. And for those people trained in classical hermeneutics, so to speak, perhaps this topic doesn't ring the same bell as it rings from the people coming from the side of hermeneutical injustice. But Matt will speak at length about this. But ever since Miranda Fricker's 2007 seminal book, Epistemic Injustice, that hermeneutical injustice has been defined as a very specific case of epistemic injustice alongside what she calls testimonial injustice. And this, even though without being directly connected to the things that were in the mind of, Paul Ricoeur, Charles Taylor, Castoriadis, and others in the tradition of social hermeneutics, has very specific and possible connections, which is the fact that every meaning is always socially constructed. There are possibilities of injustice arising from unjust social orders that affect the capacities of people to construct meaning and to interpret their own lives even in a narrative manner, etc. And so I guess, and this is one of the reasons why we're here today in this session, that there are very meaningful connections between these different lines of continental and analytical, political and social philosophy in these domains. And I think Matt will do a wonderful job of articulating some of these connections in his talk. So as I told you, Matt will talk on hermeneutical injustice and moral articulation. And Matthew, now please correct me if I'm saying something which is not updated, but Matt is assistant professor of philosophy and director of undergraduate studies at Vanderbilt University. He's a philosopher specializing in ethics, social philosophy, and aesthetics. Has worked about emotions, interpersonal recognition, moral change, among others. And he has recently published a book very recently actually, at Oxford University Press in November of this year, called Moral Articulation, on the development of new moral concepts. And so I guess you'll be drawing a little bit from your book too for today's presentation. We're eager to listen to you, Matt. Please go ahead. The floor is yours. And thank you for joining.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. It's really wonderful to be able to share this work with you. I'm sad that my friend Hilkia can't be here today. She's in a way, I think she's the real expert on hermeneutical injustice, but I'll try to sort of muddle through. But it's a delight to be able to chat with you all about this. So yeah, as Gonzalo mentioned, I will be drawing a bit from a recently published monograph of mine called A Moral Articulation. And basically, I wanted to, well, in terms of the history of how that book came about, I mean, one of the ways that it was motivated, there are a number of different sort of ideas or sources of inspiration, but one major one was thinking about the very way that Miranda Fricker discusses this problem that she calls moral hermeneutical injustice. So I'll try to trace a little bit of a line from that problem. And one debate that arose between her and Linda Alcoff in some of the initial the initial reception of epistemic injustice, and then use some ideas from my monograph in order to think about them. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Bring this up. All right, how does that look? It's visible. Everyone can see. Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right. So the title of this, and also I'm just going to shrink down my picture because I can't look at myself while I talk. There we go. One more thing. Just setting this up. Great. Okay. So yeah, the title of the title of this paper is Hermeneutical Injustice and Moral Articulation. And it starts off from this idea of hermeneutical injustice, which, as Gonzalo said, comes from the 2007 book by Miranda Fricker titled Epistemic Injustice, Power and the Ethics of Knowing. And so, as many of you probably know, this book introduces the central thesis, the idea that there is a distinctive kind of injustice called epistemic injustice, which wrongs us or harms us in our capacities as knowers. And as part of elaborating this thesis, she spells out two distinct sorts of epistemic injustice. One called testimonial injustice, which I won't discuss in this paper, and a second, which she comes to in chapter 7 of Epistemic Injustice, hermeneutical injustice, which after offering a kind of preliminary sketch of the idea and then elaborating different definitions, finally arrives at this, which I take to be her kind of like authoritative definition. Hermeneutical injustice is the injustice of having some significant area of one's social experience obscured from collective understanding, owing to a structural identity prejudice in the collective hermeneutical resource. And so the most sort of discussed case, very famous case study that she uses is the case of someone experiencing what we are now in a position to call sexual harassment in a time and place prior to the development of the vocabulary and a conceptual apparatus of sexual harassment. So we can imagine, so at least in the United States context, which is the context in which Fricker discusses this case primarily, the phrase and legal framework of sexual harassment wasn't developed until the mid 1970s. So we're meant to imagine a case, and not so difficult thing to imagine, a case of someone experiencing sexual harassment in, say, the 1950s, experiencing some form of unwelcome sexual attention, say, in the workplace, but lacking the hermeneutical resources in order to do justice to that experience. So just to highlight some aspects of this, so we have in the definitions, it's an injustice of having some significant area of one's social experience. So in this example, that one has been morally injured by a form of unwelcome, unwanted sexual attention, whether it's verbal, takes the form of touching, inappropriate physical contact, etc., obscured from collective understanding. So one is not able to make a kind of publicly legible moral grievance, or even formulate it properly, even whether to others or even to interpret it for themselves. So they experience themselves as in kind of only hazily apprehending that they're angry or that there is agitation, but not being able to put into words what exactly it is they're experiencing. And then there's this next bit, owing to a structural identity prejudice as part of her definition. So what does this mean? She wants to focus on cases where the relevant concepts or linguistic tools or hermeneutical resources are not missing for merely accidental reasons, but for structural reasons. So in this case, so generally because, at least in her paradigm case of hermeneutical injustice, some group has been structurally prevented from participating in the shared practice of creating concepts, creating words, either because they're not allowed to participate or they're discouraged from participating in legal practices or education practices or news outlets or different areas where concepts, words, hermeneutical tools are developed and refined. So in this case, it's not an accident that women who would have a special interest in being able to articulate and conceptualize experiences of sexual harassment are excluded from the kinds of practices of vocabulary building and concept creation that would allow them to have this concept or allow this concept to develop. And then finally, there's this idea that that there's this lack of the relevant concepts in the quote unquote collective hermeneutical resource. This is one aspect of Fricker's view that has probably come under the most criticism in the years following the book, mostly because she speaks of the collective hermeneutical resource in the singular in this quote and in other passages in the book. Many people point out, well, no, there isn't one collective public hermeneutical resources. There are many. There are kind of countercultural and anti-hegemonic hermeneutical resources that bubble up in things like consciousness raising groups and counterpublics, to use a phrase that Nancy Fraser and Sally Haslinger have been using, or Charles Mills has ways of talking about there being different kind of alternative epistemologies that allow for different sources of new concepts and new words and new linguistic ways of interpreting social experiences. Fricker has, as far as I can tell, pretty much accepted that criticism, but still wants to say, but nevertheless, there's a kind of we can still identify something called hermeneutical injustice here, even if we acknowledge that we shouldn't speak of the collective hermeneutical resource in the kind of sheer monolithic singular. But I'm going to focus on a different kind of criticism, or at least question, that has come up for Fricker, that came up for Fricker very quickly after in a book symposium on epistemic injustice, shortly after its publication, I believe in the journal Episteme, and this comes from Linda Alkoff. So I apologize in advance. This is a fairly long quote. It's going to go on for 3 slides, but it's an important one, and it did inspire quite a bit of the this monograph that I mentioned that I was working on, at least one aspect of it. So I'm going to read it at length. So in response to thinking about this phenomenon of hermeneutical injustice that Marta Fricker had introduced in chapter 7 of Epistemic Injustice, Alkoff writes, "This raises a question for me, however, about Fricker's account of hermeneutical injustice, especially when she says things like, quote, hermeneutical lacunas are like holes in the ozone. I wonder if this implies a realist account of meaning as reference to already existing fully formed objects existing like global warming, whether they are acknowledged by this season's political administration or not. Language is rather more complicated, I think, especially in regard to the sensitive political interactions Fricker is so often concerned with. That is, our ability to name experiences can, in some cases, change their shape and their affective texture. Consider again the case of sexual harassment, in which the term we use to classify the experience changes it from amorphous or generic aggravation to a specific and remediable injustice, or from women's lot in life to communally sanctioned harm. There is a rather sensitive relationship between the way life appears and feels and the conceptual repertoire we have available to us to describe it, and changes in the terms by which we bring experiences under a description can affect the actual things themselves, especially insofar as these are experiences that are referred to by the terms." So she phrases this as a question. This comes actually, if you look back at this article, the very last paragraph, just as a question to Fricker, like when we're attempting to overcome or move beyond conditions of hermeneutical injustice, and we coin new phrases and we develop new constellations of concepts, like the kind of network of concepts related to sexual harassment, this new way of speaking about unwelcome attention, sexual attention in places like work. What are we doing? Are we just filling in these lacunae, which is or gaps, which is the metaphor that Fricker often works with? So there's already some like sort of blank spot. There is something meaningful and significant there. We just need a label for it. Or are we doing something that involves a kind of more sensitive relationship between the phenomena we are naming and the new names or the new concepts we are developing? So this raised a question for me, which became one of the central questions in my book. Um, what are we doing when we bring ethically significant phenomena under new descriptions? Are we naming moral realities that already exist, fully formed and intact prior to their expression in language? Or do ethical phenomena bear a more sensitive relation to the descriptions under which they fall, such that developments in moral language help constitute the objects they bring to light? Um, I think there are, at least for me, so this is more of a personal report, two intuitions in tension when one raises this question. On the one hand, I feel very much the pull of both a realist intuition. So on the one hand, I think I would like to be able to say things like there were genuine experiences of sexual harassment prior to 1975. There were real forms of suffering that were produced. It was connected with very real forms of gender-based oppression, such that the new vocabulary of sexual harassment succeeds in doing justice to some reality that preceded the new set of concepts. Yet on the other hand, I have a kind of historicist intuition, especially about the nature of language, that language is not merely a tool for labeling objects or communicating independent truth, but has a deeply sensitive relationship to who we are, our communities, the way we speak, the way we conceive of ourselves, what we actually become as a way of describing ourselves under a new set of terms. And so there's both this desire to do justice to the realist intuition, but also the deeply transformative potential of language and new words and new concepts. So I was prompted to think about the prospects for something like a historicized realism about these kinds of cases. Well, what would it look like to try to do justice to both of these intuitions at once? To try to say, yes, they are attempting to respond to and do justice to very real forms of suffering, real experiences, real forms of ethically meaningful phenomena and patterns and practices in the social world, while at the same time recognizing that when we introduce new concepts and new worlds into social circulation and they get some kind of uptake in the way that the concept of sexual harassment has, that can have really deeply transformative effects on the very fabric of ethical life itself. So we seem to be doing two things at once, trying to give a realist account of what ethical life is like, while also making an intervention into that ethical life. But how do you, what's an account that could do justice to both of those? And this is the results of my attempts to try to answer this as a new book, Moral Articulation on the Development of New Moral Concepts, which came out earlier this year with Oxford University Press. And in it, I try to do a few things. So the main theme of the book is that it explores the historical development of moral language. And the case of the development of sexual harassment is one example I deal with in the book. It tries to develop and defend a version of historicized moral realism. So again, trying to do justice to both of the intuitions I just mentioned. And it also, I'm going to speak less about this in this particular presentation, but it also tries to defend a picture of moral meaning as including what I call proto-discursive forms of moral experience. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. The way I start the book then is I expand it beyond just the case of sexual harassment to think about other similar kinds of cases. So there are, we can think just in the past 100 years or so, many, many moral terms that are extremely familiar to us and are extremely important and kind of indispensable in everyday contemporary ethical talk are fairly young, especially when you measure them against the full history of the human linguistic capacity. So just to give a few more examples, and of course, so my examples will all be about the dating of these in terms of their appearance in the English language, but racism appeared around the turn of the century, but was not used pejoratively until the 1930s, primarily to condemn anti-Semitism in Europe. The term genocide was not invented until 1942, when it was coined by a Polish jurist named Raphael Lemkin, who fled Nazi occupation. He was interested in developing a term that would be able to do justice to a distinctive sort of crime he saw occurring not only in the Nazi Holocaust, but also in the Armenian genocide. The term sexism was not coined until it was first used in 1965 by Pauline M. Leet in a speech at Franklin and Marshall College. And in 1968 was its first use actually in a published print piece of writing in a book called Born Female by Carolyn Bird. The funny anecdote about that is that initially when Carolyn Bird coined this term sexism, and she coins it self-consciously by way of an analogy with the existing term racism. But there's a note that points out that her editors told her that she couldn't use this word because they couldn't find it in the dictionary. So they advised her to use an existing word. The concept of sexual harassment, already mentioned, would have to wait for another full decade. Most sources point to its invention in 1975 in Ithaca, New York, as part of a feminist consciousness raising group. Some accounts, very interestingly, say that its first use in public was on a placard at a political protest. Hate speech is a very young term. Most sources, I've been trying to look for earlier uses of the phrase that use it in a kind of technical sense, but most sources I've found so far point to a 1989 article by Mari Matsuda as the first instance in print. And then, of course, to this list, we could add many others. So child abuse was not developed until, I believe, the 1960s. Climate crisis, it was a recent term that's, there are articles discussing how this is sort of slowly began to overtake the popularity of earlier terms like global warming in some circles, at least. Domestic violence is a term developed in the 1960s and 70s. So we could add many more to this. But when we consider that the human language, the human linguistic capacity, not just writing, but I'm thinking about spoken language generally, very roughly is estimated to be something like 150,000 to 200,000 years old. These words are in their infancy. So even though our moral vocabularies would be kind of unthinkable without them, in the present, they're just babies in terms of how old they are as concepts and words. So in thinking about these, I began to think about two tendencies in contemporary ethics that had made it difficult to do justice, at least I felt, to these kinds of examples. One is a tendency to think of meaning as discursive exhaustively. So contemporary ethical theory tends to focus its attention on situations whose descriptions are already given. Think of trolley problems where we're just given a description of some case. And the idea is that the task of describing it isn't itself ethical. We just get a neutral description, and then the ethical task is to judge what the choice would be that we'd make, whether we go one way on the trolley or one or the other. But the idea is that the description is already given, and the moral concepts and judgments that are used in those descriptions are already in discursive shape. And then my conviction or my thought, especially when thinking about all these historical examples of the development of moral language, is that this skips over the process of forming those descriptions, concepts, and judgments in the first place. And a process or a struggle, you might say, that is ethical in its own right. It's an ethical task that can be, that undertaking it is itself part of the work of morality, and not just an antecedent to the proper work of morality. And so I wanted to call this process, this struggle, moral articulation. So beyond these kind of textbook examples of trolley problems and other kinds of descriptions of moral situations as already just given, I wanted to, this tendency in ethics of thinking about meaning as discursive all the way down, I found had some kind of theoretical roots. By discursive here, I just mean already in a form suitable for expression in language. We could talk more about what that means later. But this is often attributed, so we find this as a kind of general semantic theory. It's often attributed to Kant, to Frege's context principle. Early Wittgenstein and Tractatus seems to adopt versions of Frege's context principle. where the idea is like the minimal, and Brandom is often, I guess, a contemporary theorist who makes this most explicit, saying things like the judgment or the proposition is the minimum unit of rational awareness, or meaningful awareness. But in ethics, more specifically, we often find this tendency to take the moral judgment or the evaluative proposition as a basic building block of moral meaning. So that's the first tendency that this account of moral articulation found I wasn't quite happy with, how that tendency seemed to me to militate against thinking deeply about the process of moral articulation, which would have to start from experiences which were not yet discursive in shape. Come back to that in one moment. But the second tendency, and this is the one that I'm going to speak about much more today, is what I call the immutability thesis. So another tendency that we find in ethics today holds roughly this, that if objective moral grounds exist, those grounds must be traceable back to grounds that are immutable. So if we're talking about something that really is a genuine moral truth or has some claim to ethical objectivity, then either it or something underlying it is eternal, immutable, unchangeable, not subject to historical flux. And there's a equally familiar, I think, variation of this thesis, which takes contrapositive form. If some putative moral grounds are discovered to be mutable, they must not be objective. So certain kinds of, say, genealogical critique that might reveal that certain values or norms thought to be eternal are actually have a historical development, conclude that they must not be objective because they have a form of historical development behind them. That is another way of presuming the immutability thesis. But it's never been clear to me that the immutability thesis is true. It is very old. Here's a really, really old version of it. So in Antigone, by Sophocles, you find when, of course, remember, Antigone's buried her brother not once, but twice in violation of Creon's royal decree. She's brought before Creon to answer for her deed. And what does she say? She says to Creon, who's brought this merely human law forbidding the burial rites of Polynices outside the gates, Antigone says, I did not believe your proclamation had such power to enable one who will someday die to override God's ordinances, unwritten and secure. They are not of today and yesterday. They live forever. None knows when first they were. So the laws that compel Antigone to bury her brother are not of today or yesterday. They transcend the ephemera of historical flux. And so, maybe if Antigone were thinking about the kind of sexual harassment case, she might say, we need new terms sometimes to catch up with the changing social reality, but the underlying moral demand, the underlying fundamentally objective morality that grounds the claim that something like sexual harassment is wrong must be traceable back to something, maybe some kind of Kantian principle of treating people as never treating people as mere means or something like that. There must be something underneath that is not subject to any kind of change. There's a kind of Kantian argument for the immutability thesis that, as far as I can see, is I find to be the most compelling argument for it, even though I ultimately reject it. And it goes something like this. If a moral principle is objective, then it holds for the will of every rational being. This is how Kant defines the objectivity of a moral principle in the groundwork, holding for the will of every rational being. If you combine that with something I think Kant would agree with, the set of all rational beings extends not only across all of space, but all of time. So I mentioned space just because we know, Kant says in this passage from the groundwork that moral requirements, if they're truly objective, should not hold for human beings only, but all rational beings. So they should be grounded in our anthropology or our empirical circumstances, but in our rational nature, such that hypothetically, if, say, rational aliens were discovered to exist, the categorical imperative, the same principle would flow through their wills and constrain it. So that's true as a generalization across space or to other, say, species of rational creature, but it's also true across all of time. So if we go back, it doesn't matter whether we're looking at very, very early humanity, early hunter-gatherer societies, medieval peasants or people today, as long as they all qualify as rational, the same basic moral principle should operate through their wills. So hence, if a moral principle is objective, it holds for the will of all rational beings across time. That again, I think is to me at least one of the most compelling and difficult to overcome arguments in favor of the immutability thesis. I do want to note one point though, because I mentioned Antigone and Kant, who are, at least in the way that I'm framing it, are defenders of moral objectivity. But critics of moral objectivity can hold the immutability thesis as well. And this you can think about the contrapositive formulation of the immutability thesis. So if we discover that some putatively objective grounds are actually historical, we've thereby undermined their claimed objectivity. There's a passage in Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy where Bernard Williams says something roughly along those lines. So here he's writing specifically about an attempt to ground an objective ethical theory in human nature along the lines of Aristotle's ethics. He writes, "We only have to compare Aristotle's catalogue of the virtues with any that might be produced now to see how pictures of an appropriate human life may differ in spirit and in the actions and institutions they call for. That idea is deeply entrenched in any naturalistic or, again, historical conception of human nature, that is, in any adequate conception of it, and I find it hard to believe that it will be overcome by an objective inquiry, or that human beings could turn out to have a much more determinate nature than is suggested by what we already know, one that timelessly demanded a life of a particular kind. The project of giving to ethical life an objective and determinate grounding in considerations about human nature is not, in my view, very likely to succeed." So the point to highlight about this passage is this, that he uses the idea of a historical conception of human nature, that is, any adequate conception of it, he says, as grounds for rejecting an objective and determinate grounding of morals in human nature. So there's an implicit premise. There's here, which is a contrapositive version of the immutability thesis, which runs something like this. If human nature turns out to be mutable, it cannot serve as an objective moral ground. So all that's just to say, you don't have to defend moral objectivity to hold the immutability thesis because it's a conditional. If there is such a thing as objective morality, there must be some kind of underlying ahistorical grounds that underwrite it. Both defenders of objectivity in ethics and its critics can equally hold the immutability thesis, and many have. So into the fray comes my book, Moral Articulation on the Development of New Moral Concepts. And I'm not going to give a kind of wholesale overview of the book, but just very briefly, the first half of the book is devoted to criticizing the discursive theory of meaning. So chapters 1 through 3 defend an expanded picture of moral meaning and rationality beyond the discursive. And secondly, against the immutability thesis, chapters 4 through 6, which are the remaining chapters of the book, defend a historicized variation of moral realism. I'm going to focus here because I think it bears more on the question of hermeneutical injustice and the issue that Alcoff raises, or the question that Alcoff raises for Fricker, about, well, what exactly are we doing when we invent terms like sexual harassment that give voice to forms of suffering that were previously inarticulate and subject to these conditions of hermeneutical injustice? How transformative are these new concepts, or are they transformative at all? Do we want to say with Antigone or Kant that they're new at the level of mere description, but the level of underlying moral values, nothing can change. And I want to argue against the immutability thesis. So at the heart of the book is a distinction between descriptions and articulations, which of course comes from the philosopher Charles Taylor, whose work I draw from extensively in the book. It's a great source of inspiration for me. And anyone here, probably, I imagine in this group, many people are very familiar with Charles Taylor's work, but the concept of articulation has been developed over many, many decades at this point. There's, of course, the recent book, The Language Animal, but early essays, like What is Human Agency, developed this in a really interesting way. I'm not going to get in the weeds with Charles Taylor's own work, but just develop systematically the basic distinction between descriptions and articulations that I think is relevant for this question that we're facing. So very roughly, descriptions. We'll use descriptions in a technical sense and reserve them for things like this. The earth is round, the table has 4 legs, where we predicate some object with some predicate. And there are 2 features to notice about descriptions. They strive to be faithful to an object, so it matters whether the earth is actually round, or that the table does in fact have 4 legs and not 3. But at the same time, they leave the object unchanged. So no amount of pontificating about the flatness of the earth will actually make it flat if it isn't already. Meanwhile, we'll use the term articulations technically for a different kind of linguistic activity. And we'll start with these kinds of cases that I think get at this more easily. I'm angry because, so I'm articulating some kind of emotional state from the first person perspective. Or collectively, our friendship is like, so I'm sitting with you, we are friends, we had a fight, and now we're getting coffee together, and we're trying to say we're trying to articulate the nature of our friendship, why it's meaningful to us, who we are such that we have this relationship. There are 2 features to note about articulations. One is the same as descriptions. They strive to be faithful to an object. I'll put object in scare quotes. I'm actually okay calling things like anger and friendship objects, as long as we don't get too hung up on a technical definition of what an object is. All that means is that they are somehow the target or the thing that's being picked out and expressed by articulation. But depending on your theory of what an object is, you may not want to think of them as objects in some classical sense. But anyway, articulations strive to be faithful to the object. So it matters that, when I'm trying to understand and self-interpret my anger, there are ways that I could interpret my own anger that are diluted, that are wrong, that fail to understand certain nuances of my own anger. So there is a kind of epistemic aspect to that activity. Similarly, if you and I are sitting together to interpret the meaning of our friendship, we could be deluded about that very friendship. We could get things wrong, and we can also get things right. So there is some degree of faithfulness to an object. But unlike descriptions, our acts of articulation at least have the potential to transform that very object. So if I start with a very inchoate sense of anger, and then I slowly develop a vocabulary for why it is that I'm angry, and I start using metaphors or different kinds of concepts, I say it's not just that I'm overreacting, that I have a kind of righteous indignation. I start to put it into words that anger itself isn't an object like a planet that just sits there waiting to be discovered, but it can actually grow and develop as a result of our efforts to conceptualize it. Similarly, with a friendship, if you and I sit having coffee to talk about our friendship, especially after a fight, that very act of sitting together talking and self-interpreting is itself an event in the very friendship that we're interpreting. So the friendship would be something different if we were not engaged in that activity of interpreting it. So the object of articulation, unlike description, is not left unchanged by the activity of expressing it. So the way I put this in the book, and this again is very closely following Charles Taylor, articulation follows an expressive logic. It brings something to light while developing the very thing brought to light. So again, one more example, compare describing the sea as tempestuous with describing one's own emotions as tempestuous. So if I describe the sea as tempestuous, that might change my understanding of the sea, but it won't change the sea itself. By contrast, if I use this metaphor of a tempest, of a violent, unpredictable storm to describe my own emotional state, that could actually alter the felt significance and quality of my actual emotional state, because emotions have histories and they develop alongside their interpretations. So with this, we can come to the new version of this question. Might the successful development of new concepts and languages, such as the concept sexual harassment, to bring us back to the hermeneutical injustice case, involve not just accurate descriptions, but articulations of objective features of ethical life? And I answer that in the affirmative in the book, and I say that against the discursive theory of meaning, so the first part of the book, I say that articulating X is not just a matter of making explicit meanings that were implicitly discursive all along, but creating new possibilities for discourse out of proto-discursive experience. I won't have much to say about that today, but that's the first half of the book. I'm going to focus today on the second half, which is against the immutability thesis, because again, I think it bears more, at least on the aspect of the debate about hermeneutical injustice that I want to discuss today. Against the immutability thesis, articulating X involves both striving to be faithful to and developing new possibilities for X. Against Williams, we can say this about the conditions of human flourishing. So the big upshot is that what we're really articulating all along is ourselves and our nature, or the kinds of creatures we are when we're developing new concepts like sexual harassment. We're trying to understand the vulnerabilities of the human, and we are both trying to be faithful to the conditions, to articulating the conditions of human flourishing, but also not necessarily leaving those conditions unchanged, because we are historical creatures. I'm going to focus in this talk exclusively on the second. So this will be drawing some argument from these latter chapters, chapters 4 through 6 of the book. And just to jump straight to what my thesis will be. So I'll state this now, and then we'll try to get there. We could call this moral articulation's hermeneutical circle. I want to say something like this, that we occupy a shared life form, which I want to develop in a kind of, to a certain extent, a kind of classical Aristotelian sense. I want to think about ethics as grounded in the kinds of creatures we are, but I'm going to give it a kind of Hegelian, again, following Taylor very closely, a kind of Hegelian twist and historicize it. We have a shared life form. There's a kind of creature we are that sets out the kind of horizon for the possibility of objective ethical meanings. That is what grounds the development of new moral concepts. So new moral concepts ought not to arise willy-nilly, but should in some sense be grounded in this attempt to be faithful to a shared life form. Yet at the same time, those new moral concepts articulate that very life form in the technical sense we just got from Taylor. They don't just strive to be faithful to it, but they also develop it, potentially mature it in new directions. So something like this is going to be, this structure is my attempt to develop a historicized variation of moral realism. And so coming back to Fricker and Alcoff, answer kind of yes, both options. Yes, a form of realism, and yes, a deeply transformative picture of new developments in moral concepts and language. Okay, so one of the ways I do this in the latter half of the book is by asking whether we should think of moral articulation as a form of discursive construction. I'm thinking of this phrase in the way that social philosophers like Ian Hacking and more recently Sally Haslinger have developed the idea. And so this is a starting point for thinking about this. Is moral articulation a form of discursive construction? Is that the right way to think about the development of concepts like sexual harassment? So I'll just borrow, this is kind of a slightly modified version of Sally Haslinger's definition of discursive construction. She writes, this comes from, and I can't remember which one, but an essay in Resisting Reality. And it's, again, I've slightly modified the end of it, but something is discursively constructed just in case it is the way it is to some substantial extent because of the ways it is expressed and or expresses itself in language. That's pretty wide. Note the caveat here, to some substantial extent. So the idea, for example, she follows her definition that is roughly along these lines with saying that human beings are discursively constructed. Now, by that, she doesn't mean we are simply the products of language, that we are made up by what we say full stop, but that to some substantial extent, who we are is developed and constituted by the ways we express ourselves in language, in concert with many other forces like biological forces, material forces, and so forth. So it's an important caveat. So the question is moral articulation a special form of discursive construction? To home in on an answer to this, I ask the following kind of, or I note the following kind of typology. So discursive acts can have either, both, or neither of the following aims. On the one hand, discursive acts can have the aim of illumination. So discursive acts aim at illuminating genuine features of the object and can be criticized on that basis. The table has 4 legs, illuminates a feature of the table, namely that its four-leggedness. Sexual harassment, that saying an act is an instance of sexual harassment does aim to illuminate the nature of the act, that it involves some kind of exploitation of power dynamics rooted in gender, say, and however else we want to describe what sexual harassment is. Secondly, they can have the aim of maturation. So the discursive act aims at maturing or developing the object in a direction of flourishing or goodness. And what I want to say is that moral articulation is both, and in a way that relates 1 and 2, so that the very object that is illuminated is also matured in that instance. So to give a more concrete example of this, so what is an example of a discursive act or set of discursive acts that both illuminate and mature its object? I'm going to draw a slightly extended example from a novel by E.M. Forster called Morris. It was completed in 1914, but then published posthumously in 1971 because of its depiction of homosexual love and attraction and romance. Forster appends a kind of there's a note appended to the now published version of Morris, where Forster explains his reason for not publishing the book in his own lifetime, fearing he would be charged with certain laws against pornography, and in the time would have been a bad idea for him. So Morris and Clive are the main characters of this story. They are 2 young men living and studying at a kind of Oxbridge type university around the time of the writing of this book, around the early 20th century. And it's a time when, of course, homosexuality is kind of multiply condemned. So you can think about it in terms of the problem of hermeneutical injustice. There are concepts available to describe homosexual love and attraction between 2 men, but the concepts that are available are already filtered or established in some way as to condemn it. So religion, in their context, will condemn it as a sin. Medicine will condemn it as a congenital illness. There's a point in the novel where Morris goes to the doctor to talk about this, and the doctor very compassionately, but mistakenly, just explains to Morris, well, you have a congenital illness and we can try to cure you. Law interprets it through the lens of illegality, and just popular culture and common sense generally regards it as a kind of aberration. Nevertheless, Morris and Clive discover that they are attracted to each other, and very slowly over the course of the novel find ways to articulate their love to each other in creative ways. And then for us philosophers, some of these are nice. They read the symposium together, and they have discussions about it. They develop a kind of metaphorical language of beauty. They contrast the beauty they see in each other to the beauty anyone can see in a Michelangelo. And they develop this, like in the novel, this complex metaphor about the beauty they have found in each other. They have extended conversations. Much of the novel just is them trying to sit together and find some way of articulating how they feel about each other. And I want to say that this is a good example of the kind of discursive act that we're looking for. Their discursive acts aim at both the illumination and the maturation of their love. Their love is thus discursively constructed. It is what it is to a significant extent because of how it has been expressed in language, but it's discursively constructed in a special way. It's articulated. So their love would not be what it is if they had not struggled to try to put it into words and concepts, new metaphors, new narratives. But what they're doing is both trying to be faithful to something that they deeply felt prior to their efforts of articulation, but also develop that love in new directions. So we get a kind of example of what this expressive logic of articulation is here. Here's a quote from the novel. "And their love scene drew out, having the inestimable gain of a new language. No tradition overawed the boys, no convention settled what was poetic, what absurd. They're concerned with a passion that few English minds have admitted and so created untrammeled. Something of exquisite beauty arose in the mind of each at last, built of the humblest scraps of speech and from the simplest emotions. So, what I try to establish is a kind of analogy between intimate articulation on the scale of like a Morris and a Clive, and moral articulation on a much bigger social scale. So, we can ask this question. When we struggle together to articulate the conditions of human flourishing, creating new concepts and languages to do so, might we be aiming at both illumination and maturation in a way that is at least analogous to the joint activity of Morris and Clive? And so for the present purposes, I'm going to focus on just one amongst many obstacles to securing this analogy. It's a very difficult one, but for the sake of time, I'll focus on just one problem. But let me make one note before going on to the analogy. In some ways, and I try to say this at certain points in the book, we could also think of this as more than just an analogy. So of course, Morris and Clive are engaged in a very intimate struggle of articulation that is about the two of them, and they are in a way very isolated from the rest of their social context in that activity. They undertake it very much in like a person-to-person like setting. But when we sort of scale up and we think about social movements that are attempting to morally articulate or expand our conceptions of who it is appropriate to love, or who it is appropriate to marry or live with or be in a romantic or erotic relationship with, that are working against homophobic or patriarchal or heteronormative conceptions of what love and romance and the erotic are, what is it other than a kind of scaled up version of many, many Morrises and Clives trying to articulate the nature of that kind of love and how it fits into a broad conception of human flourishing? So it's an analogy, but it's also on a continuum, I want to say, with these much larger scale activities of moral articulation that are important to me in the book. Let me come to the obstacle. So the major obstacle, as you may guess, is the one I've already spent some time thinking about it. It's the immutability thesis. So one of the things that gets in the way of thinking about this analogy between the case where, Morris and Clive develop and mature their relationship as they struggle to articulate it on the one hand, on the other, that we as human beings develop and mature are the very kinds of creatures we are as parts of our struggles to put into language the conditions of our flourishing and suffering, is the immutability thesis, which basically comes down to the claim that, well, if there is any objectivity, if there's any objective moral grounds behind this activity or grounding this activity of moral articulation, there must be at least some ahistorical core that is securing all of this, that is providing the kind of foundation for this activity. So again, the way I formulated it earlier was as a conditional. If objective moral grounds exist, they must be traceable back to grounds that are historically alterable. And if some putative moral grounds are discovered to be historically alterable, they must not be objective. So I said earlier that I wanted to think about this in roughly Aristotelian terms as my alternative as grounded in a conception of the kinds of creatures we are. And this is a conception of ethics that goes back to Aristotle. I think that this is a fairly unique feature of Aristotle's ethics, at least when compared to very prominent modern frameworks for thinking about ethical foundations and objectivity in ethics that we've inherited from Kant and from the classical utilitarians. In Kant, we already saw, I think Kant is committed to the immutability thesis. There just is no moral objectivity without the immutability thesis, because the objectivity of a moral principle is defined in terms of its being shared by all rational beings, and all rational beings are part of a set that extends across time. But also in utilitarianism, I mean, of course, like, you can have a contemporary utilitarian who develops all kinds of new concepts and thinks we need to change our moral conceptions because of, growing technologies or the threat of climate change, and so forth. Nevertheless, like the basic underlying values, as articulated by the principle of utility, that is not subject to any kind of historical change. So there's In these other moral theories, there's ample room for historicism in a kind of moderate or partial sense. We need to develop new words and concepts and extend the values that we already have. But there's some kind of ineliminable ahistorical core to morality. I don't think this has to be the case for Aristotle, or at least for an Aristotelian ethic. Of course, you can be an Aristotelian and think that there's a fixed table of virtues, but I don't think it's a necessary feature of Aristotle's ethics. So, as I say here, though many versions of Aristotelian ethics assume an ahistorical core of morality, for example, a fixed table of virtues, strictly speaking, Aristotelian ethics can get along fine without it. And I take the core thesis of Aristotelian ethics to be this, that objective ethical requirements are grounded in the sorts of creatures we are. In contemporary terms, I'm thinking of people who've developed this thought, like, of course, Philippa Foot in her book Natural Goodness, and Michael Thompson and Rosalind Hursthouse. And I just want to add to this that the sorts of creatures we are can change. And as we were discussing earlier, I want to say that articulation, in this Taylorian sense of developing new concepts and words, is one of the major ways in which we can change ourselves over time. So just to get a little bit more, I won't go too deep into this, a little bit more into the nitty-gritty details of how this works. Contemporary ethical naturalists have identified this kind of parallel between judgments we make about the living creatures and ethical judgments. So starting with the judgments of plants and animals, we can say things like X's wings are well developed. And anyone familiar with Philippa Foot or Michael Thompson will get that this, I'm rehearsing some well-known arguments from them. X's wings are well developed. Y's root system is healthy. Z's eyes are functioning well. These are normative judgments we can make about living creatures. A very simple point that is noted by contemporary ethical naturalists writing in an Aristotelian vein is this, that it matters very much what species X belongs to, or X and Y and Z belong to. We need to know something about their life form in order to know whether these judgments are true. So whether X's wings are well developed matters, it will depend very much on whether X is a hummingbird or an albatross. Hummingbird wings on an albatross would not be well developed, but they are perfectly fine on a hummingbird. Is Y's root system healthy? Well, it depends whether that root system belongs to an oak or a cactus. And it matters very much whether to the question of whether Z's eyes are functioning well, whether it's an owl or an octopus or an eagle or a human for that matter. So what's the lesson of these kinds of cases? It's that of what they call life form dependence. Features that are healthy and typical of one life form may be unhealthy, depriving, or lethal in another. And so there's a distinctive class of normative evaluations of living things that are life form dependent or life form relative. And moreover, these are objective evaluations in that they are not grounded in the judging subject's desires, projects, commitments, etc. So they're contrasted with things like this octopus would be good to eat, which is grounded in the judge's own subjective preferences about what they find tasty, say, or this cow or this horse would be good for pulling a plow. They're not like those sorts of evaluations, which are ultimately have their normativity rooted in some kind of project or desire. They're objective in that the judge must see them as grounded in something exterior to the judge, namely the life form of the creature in question. So the one major claim, and again, there are many, many controversies with this claim, which of course I'm going through very quickly, but the claim of Aristotelian ethical naturalists is that judging human ethical life follows this pattern. Ascriptions of virtue, vice, and other forms of ethical assessment are no less dependent upon the life form of the creature being assessed. They're just as life form relative or life form dependent. If we add to this the idea that life forms can change, nothing in the structure of life form dependent evaluative thought relies on the supposition that owls, oaks, octopuses, or humans have fixed or inalterable nature. So the way this has come up mainly in existing literature and Aristotelian ethical naturalism has been in response to the question of whether people like Foot and Thompson and Hursthouse can handle like Darwinian evolution, and they all claim that they can. And they don't need to assume that there's something like a Platonic fixed ahistorical life form of the owl, which exists independently of all historical development, but can be subject to gene mutations and natural selection and things like that. It's enough that there's a stable enough life form that gives us a reference at a particular snapshot of historical time, such that we can judge a creature's vital features in comparison with it. And so, if that's right, then life form dependent evaluative judgment provides us with a model for a form of evaluation that is simultaneously objective and historical in a deep sense. And by deep sense, I mean it can run all the way down to the kinds of creatures we are. There is no need to postulate an ahistorical core that is simply in principle beyond the possibility of any kind of alteration or, in our sense, articulation. The human life form can be viewed as historical through and through. So this opens conceptual space for the idea that our struggles to articulate the ethical meaning of being human follow the expressive logic of articulation rather than the straightforward logic of description. The ultimate object of moral articulation, then, is the sorts of creatures we are. So we might, in like a historically contextualized case, say, well, the object of moral articulation in this case is this instance of unwelcome sexual attention in the workplace and what we should call it and how we should think about it and what our patterns of inference should be surrounding it. So in some narrower sense, we might say that's the object. But what I would like to say is that in the most general sense, what we're doing whenever we develop new ethical concepts is we're articulating the kinds of creatures we are, what the conditions are for our flourishing, what we need to live well, to survive, to be actualized and fulfilled. So we get this structure that I referred to earlier as the hermeneutical circle of moral articulation. We have a shared life form. That shared life form grounds our moral articulations. It's what makes it such that we are responding to real forms of suffering when we generate concepts like genocide or sexual harassment that we didn't simply make up. This is not a kind of voluntaristic, purely subjective constructivism about who we are. It needs to be grounded in that shared life form, but at the same time, those moral articulations develop that shared life form in new directions. So to bring this back to the question we were asking earlier, just contrast this kind of view that I've been developing with two different ways of thinking about gender-based oppression and the need to develop new concepts like sexual harassment or domestic abuse or date rape, are different kinds of concepts that have been developed over the last century as part of this. One kind of view, and it finds expression in Michelle Moody Adams in a recent book called Making Space for Justice, but also an older paper called The Idea of Moral Progress. She says, she argues that the fundamental moral concepts capable of condemning gender-based oppression have always existed, concepts like justice, equality, and dignity. And so she says very explicitly, and she discusses the case of sexual harassment, that's just all the innovation happening there, it happens at a non-evaluative descriptive level. The values of morality are eternal and unchanging, but at a descriptive level, sometimes we need to be able to apply concepts of justice, which are immutable to new cases. So that's one kind of view that you could hold. Another kind of view, this comes from Robert Pippin in his book Hegel's Practical Philosophy. He writes, it is highly implausible. And he's also writing about this, the kind of paradigm shifts in thinking about gender-based oppression. It is highly implausible that someone or some group discovered a moral fact that had lain hidden for thousands of years, in principle accessible to human beings, but unfortunately for the thousands of generations involved, undiscovered. He finds that no, that can't be the case. Of course, the development of new concepts and words and norms changes morality itself over time. So he's embracing a kind of Hegelian view, but taking it in a stronger social constructivist kind of direction. All I wish to point out, so I don't have a kind of like knockdown, takedown of either of these, but I do want to point out this, that in both cases, they're sharing the assumption of the immutability thesis. So Michelle Moody Adams' conviction that if we didn't have these eternal concepts that underlay moral criticism, we wouldn't have any kind of genuine grounding. That is a version of the immutability thesis. At the same time, Pippin's commitment to the idea that, well, no, because you can't appreciate the deeply historical nature of human ethical life and hold that there are these moral facts, that's also a version of the immutability thesis. He's assuming that as soon as we think that there are moral facts, we must be thinking about them in ahistorical terms. So they both share the same assumption, as opposed as these views are otherwise. So let us come back to our earlier question. So are we naming moral realities that already exist prior to their expression in language? Or do developments in moral language help constitute the objects they bring to light? Again, thinking about the concept of sexual harassment and other similar concepts, we can now say, and this is my big punchline, the answer is yes, both, of course. We are both naming moral realities that existed prior to their expression in language. There are real forms of suffering, real human experiences. In positive cases, real forms of solidarity, love, affection, as in the case of Morris and Clive, that the new concepts are coming into express. Yet we can say that there are deeply transformative effects. And if we think that this kind of historicized Aristotelianism is a plausible option, then we can say that the deeply transformative effects go deeper than just affecting our own self-conceptions and our social practices, but actually can reach down to the level of objective ethical values themselves by subjecting them to this expressive logic of articulation. So thank you for listening. I was told that I was allowed to speak a little bit longer than initially planned because unfortunately Hilke is not able to join us. So I hope I didn't try your patience by going on for too long. But again, that's my presentation. This is my book is out. Thank you for listening. And I'm so sorry to do this, but shameless self-promotion. If you are interested in taking a look at my book, there is a 30% off code because it is too expensive, which you can use if you purchase the book. It's directly from Oxford University Press and is there. If this screen goes away and you'd like to have that, just message me and I'm happy to give you the code. But thank you so much for listening, and I'm excited to discuss this with you in the Q&A.